You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities, so do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
We can all agree that the word iconic has been painfully overused, but today's guests are definitely worthy of that title. Whether it was Tonne Goodman's early days with the late and legendary Diana Vreeland, or Paul Cavaco's co-founding of KCD ahead of going on to become one of the most prolific male editors, their close friendship has now spanned decades and is often associated with the also iconic Liz Tilberis era of Harper's Bazaar, where they served as co-fashion directors. As we all stew in the stories of fashion's seismic shifts and the role creativity has to play, it feels like an absolute gift to wander the storied halls of two OG fashion editors whose training was clearly steeped in the perfect blend of instinct and discipline.
This is Tonne Goodman.
This is Paul Cavaco, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
We have to start off by saying thank you so much. It's such an honor to have the pair of you on the same episode and having made time on a Sunday, no less. Tonne, we're going to start with you. Having grown up in the Upper East Side with an artist mother and a surgeon father, it's no surprise that the traits that we know your work for have great precision in terms of their creative choices. But before the days of modeling or working with the late and legendary Diana Vreeland at the Met, what do you think were some of the greatest influences pressed upon your work from those days?
I think the biggest thing is my parents, of course. I mean, both of them were extraordinary people in that they were very self-disciplined and had an enormous amount and range of freedom at the same time. They never said to any of us, poor children, what are you planning to do with your life? You can't do that. You can't do this. I mean, they were so forthright. They were so elegant. They were so determined. And they were so generous that I think that the combination of those attributes gave all of us, not just me, all the Goodman children, the ability to move into a space for their futures that was going to have possibility. All sorts of possibility.
And Paul is a New Yorker as well. You grew up in the Bronx, closely identifying with your Spanish and Cuban roots, along with, of course, being a child of the hippie 60s, long before meeting Keisha Keeble, with whom you obviously set upon a very explicitly fashion-oriented path. But what comes to mind when you think about those early experiences and how they've largely shaped you or the work?
My childhood was much more gritty physically because of what it looked like. You know, growing up in the Bronx, growing up in, Fort Apache, it's a little grittier, which when you're a kid, you don't know that it's gritty. It's just where you live. How it informed the work later on is I'd never minded grittiness. I never minded the streets of New York. I never mind, darkness. I like the city. A lot of people have a more fantasy approach to fashion, which I really don't have. It's much more grounded in reality. When we became teenagers, my sister started to read music magazines. So the fashion just became the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. It was all music. Then we discovered the West Village. And that's where music was and hippies were and beatniks were and an expression of individuality that didn't really exist because if you're from the 50s and the early 60s, people dressed very similarly to each other.
I remember actually reading somewhere that you had sort of rebelled against the style of your parents. Obviously, at that time, that looked like things like bell bottoms and whatnot. But you already kind of started having a relationship to fashion around that time.
Because it was music, because music happened. Once you get involved with listening to music, playing music, I think it changes. And, those were the only magazines. We didn't know fashion magazines existed, really. I didn't know Vogue existed at all.
Tonne, you were actually discovered outside of your apartment building when you were 15, rocking that very short skirt and incredibly long hair. You eventually taking a year off between high school and art school to model, where you were photographed by the likes of Richard Avedon and Irving Penn, which obviously sounds like an incredible educational experience. But what was it about modeling that you didn't like? Was it just being in front of the camera?
Well, first of all, I think I have to add one little tidbit in here, which is Keisha Keeble, who was an editor at Vogue magazine at that time, discovered me. I was a really terrible model. And I realize now, having worked with models all of these years and seeing their brilliance and the contribution that they make to the image, which, goes without saying that visually they do, but emotionally as well, because we rely on them to be kind of gift givers. I mean, they give themselves for a photograph in a way that is so generous and so accepting and so brave in a lot of cases. I was absolutely none of those. I was terrified. I was still a virgin, I think. I'm pretty sure I was, yeah. You know, when I was on set, I didn't know how to conduct myself in a way that was giving at all. I was kind of pretty much frozen. I mean, there were certain photographers that I worked with that brought out things in me. In general, I was not a good model. And, you know, there's the famous story that is in the book about David Bailey. When I was in Paris and I was doing the collections between high school and college, and I was in the studio and I got on the set, and he, in a supreme effort to get me to do something, he said, and it was not lascivious, it was not a Me Too moment at all, but he said to me, "Look fuckable." And, you know, I didn't know how to react to that. And I'm sure I really did not look fuckable after he said that to me. But that was a pivotal moment in my modeling career. And right after that, I ran into Arthur Elgort at a cafe in Paris. And he's such a wonderful, friendly guy. He took one look at me and he said, "Why don't you go home? Why don't you get on the next plane?" And that's exactly what I did.
Was that your last shoot that you modeled in?
Yeah, I think it was. I think that was the end of that.
So from what I understand, you met Diana Vreeland first when you were modeling, and then later on ended up working for her at the Met. So in the stories that you've just shared, how do we jump from there to the Diana Vreeland days?
There's a preface to this, which is that Diana Vreeland's grandson, Alexander Vreeland, went to school with my brother. Both went to St. Bernard's, and Alexander Vreeland had a brother of his own named Nicholas Vreeland. And Nicholas Vreeland and I became very, very fast friends in the course of our kind of teenage years, I guess. So I knew Diana Vreeland through Nikki, and Nikki and I dated. I think that she was indebted to Nikki to embrace me and, you know, give me a try as a model. And there's the famous memo that she wrote to everyone on the staff that is really priceless. And, you know, don't give up on this girl. You know, she's not pretty and she doesn't know how to use her face, but don't give up on this girl. And I really think that that was an attempt, you know, a very generous attempt for her to give me a chance.
I feel like when we think about Tonne's start, we of course know the Diana Vreeland jumping off point and association. And of course, in your case, Paul, we think about the formation of KCD and what you and Keisha had built together with John. But something that wasn't entirely common at that particular time just yet was the world of freelancing. And so when you had decided to go off on your own and start freelancing, which I believe was the time that you guys had started collaborating together at Bazaar, was that a daunting kind of idea since it was sort of anything but common?
When I first entered into the industry, there were a few freelancers. I think originally what it was magazine editors could only work for the magazines. They couldn't work for designers or manufacturers. So when the ads happened, they either would use the studio manager, the girl that ran the studio, would be the person that received the clothes, would dress the model, and become the stylist, unless they could get one of the editors from the magazines to sneak out and do the shoot, which happened, you know, quite often. I know like Julie Britt, who was an incredible editor at Glamour and at Harper's Bazaar, she then decided not to work at magazines and started to work for photographers as a stylist. And I think, you know, certain editors left, and that's how that happened. So when we started working as freelance editors about the same time. I started in 76. I worked for Bruce Weber, and then I worked for Avedon right away, which was kind of funny because he was doing menswear and they needed a menswear editor, and there were no freelance menswear editors, so it became me.
There's no comparable school, right? Both of you had such incredible beginnings that at this point sound like myth and legend. With you, Tonne, having started your first shoot as a fashion editor with Helmut Newton, or am I off?
Yes.
It was Helmut Newton at New York Times Magazine, right?
Yeah. I mean, I had been at the Met, and I knew that I was never going to really get a serious job at the Met because, you know, I was a dropout. And one of the assignments that we had at the Met was covering one of the exhibitions with Carrie Donovan. And so I met Carrie. I was her kind of liaison for the shoot. And after that, Carrie invited me to come to the New York Times as a fashion editor. My title actually was fashion reporter, and I was paid $100 a week. So I started there, and it was hit the ground running, which is an expression that Paul has taught me, and it's so true. And it was just like, all right, now what am I going to do? I was in a newsroom. It wasn't a fashion magazine. It was a newsroom. And the first photographer that I was assigned was Helmut Newton, and it was a bathing suit story. What can I say? Everything that I kind of needed to know was condensed into that one experience, I think.
Also, having come from the time spent with Diana Vreeland, I don't imagine that going without something being rubbed off on you.
Well, I think the thing about Diana Vreeland was that you could not ever really understand one thing that she was saying.
Mm-hmm.
So you were left to be an interpreter.
Yeah.
And being an interpreter is a very, very handy thing to be, because there's all sorts of stuff that is thrown at you all the time that either makes sense or does not make sense. And so when I was working with Helmut, if there was a moment where I thought, I'm not quite sure what he means about this, you just had the confidence. I had the confidence after working with Mrs. Vreeland to interpret. And it served me well because it was a very good shoot. We did shoots after that. And he was a wonderful person to work with. I loved him. You know, the picture in the book is such a wonderful photograph because it literally is a moment captured in time, because the guy coming off the diving board, completely perpendicular, that's a moment that was shot, that was captured. That is not anything that was digitally enhanced or put in there. The photograph is absolutely authentic to the moment that it happened. And that is an experience that I think with the digital world and how photography and fashion photography in particular has changed, that was something that I really treasure.
I think that's why so many of those images have become such references for today, for those very reasons that you're mentioning. It's a little bit of a jump ahead in terms of years, but we can't have you on, Paul, and not talk about Madonna's sex book quite early on in that 90s moment, just before the pair of you had joined Bazaar, because it had such a huge cultural impact, and I'm sure it was quite a fun project. But can you tell us about both that experience and what that backlash may have been like for you, or was it completely irrelevant to your career as a stylist?
I don't know if there was any backlash. I'm sure there was. When you're part of the backlash, you don't know you're part of the backlash. We had been working with Madonna. I was with Stephen Meisel. I was working as his stylist. And we had just done Rolling Stone magazine for Truth or Dare. The movie was being released. And it was the publicity stuff for it. And she was in Rolling Stone and we were doing the pictures. And while she was doing the pictures with Stephen, she said to him she wanted to do this book. And, it was Garen DeFazio, the hairdresser, Francois Nars, and then me. And so she was like, want to do this? And then Stephen talked to us and we said, okay, yeah, we think it would be great to do. Although we didn't quite know what was going to happen. And I think that's the thing. I think now we're much more prepared for things. You do mood boards. I think when we worked before this, even when Tanya and I worked at Bazaar, like maybe we would have a singular picture as an inspiration. And the entire shoot would sort of go right off that one picture. So we just went off and did this shoot. And it was hilarious, which is funny because it doesn't look hilarious, but it was really funny. Every time I think, Tanya, you can speak to this too. When you have to do very sexy pictures, there's something funny about it because it's not really... You're not really having sex, no one's having. So it's not intimate in that way. There's something, you have to have a little bit of levity, because it is so intimate. We're in Miami. She's wearing a coat and a pair of heels, and that is it. She goes in, she orders a pizza. Stephen is sitting, we're sitting in the booths while she's standing at the counter. Stephen's like ready to take a picture. And then we ask if we can take a picture there. They go, yes, of course. They don't really know it's Madonna.
Mm-hmm.
I'm standing next to her. So when she takes the coat off, I grab the coat. Stephen starts to take pictures and everyone starts to freak out. There's a nude woman standing, a completely nude woman, no G-string, no nothing. And they start freaking out. They start screaming at us to leave. We have to throw the coat on Madonna. We leave. Madonna jumps in one car with Stephen. He's photographing her in the car and Fabien is driving taking a Super 8 of what's going on. He's driving with his knees while he's, filming with the Super 8. And she was glorious. I mean, she looked glorious and she was fun to work with. She was like a model. She was there for the picture. There was never a moment of, I don't want to do that. It was like, fine, let's go.
But also there was no social media. I mean, imagine had there been.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that happened that would have been much greater had we had social media is, we had shot in a house in Miami, and the woman that rented the house said she'd left while we were in the backyard photographing in her pool. She came back in and went upstairs and started to photograph Madonna, and photograph what we were shooting. And Madonna looked up, saw her, and said, there's someone with a camera there. And Julie Mannion, who is one of the owners of KCD, she ran, because she was producing it with us. She ran upstairs, asked the woman for the film, got the film out of the camera, and we took it. However, what we didn't know is that she had other film that she claimed she didn't have, and sold the pictures to Stern Magazine. And then those pictures, when they went out to Stern Magazine, came to the American press. Imagine now with your phone and everything. There would have been pictures of her at the pizza parlor, pumping gas nude at the gas station, the hitchhiking. All of that would have been released far before the book came out.
Yeah, it's such a different cultural climate. It's quite crazy, but it's also a beautiful opportunity to move into the time that you guys shared at Harper's Bazaar. And from what I understand, Tonne, you were already meant to go to Bazaar prior to you deciding to join, right, Paul?
It's the reverse. While we were doing the sex book, Fabien had been asked to be the creative director of Harper's Bazaar, and he had said to Stephen and I think you guys should come. And Stephen considered it. It got very close to coming. I had a company at the time. And I was like, my two partners had passed away. And it was like 2 years after Keisha, who was my ex-wife, had passed away. And I could no longer really do the business anymore. I did it only because she wanted to do it. So I was like, I think time has passed. And so I joined as the fashion director. And then Liz Tilberis came to me one day and said that someone had recommended Tonne, and, how would I feel about Tonne coming? I was thrilled for two reasons. One was Tonne, who I loved. We were really close friends, and I knew because of her demeanor that it would be fine to work with her. We're both Sagittarians. Tonne's November 30th, I'm December 1st, so we're very similar about a lot of things, and also very different, but we get along really well. To me, she is an incredible editor, so I was like, yeah. And also, I wanted to share it. I was not used to being alone. I had always worked with Keisha. So I was used to having a partner. That was the nicest part, is I could go in every day to Tonne's office and lament about anything I wanted to lament about, whether it was staff or family or, it's nice to have that, your best friend as the person in the office down the hall from you.
I remember watching that documentary, Vogue, The Editor's Eye, and everyone sort of struggling to answer that question of what it was that a fashion editor does. But even witnessing you on set, Tonne, I remember, I think it was BTS footage or something, and you treated it with as much value as a cover image moment. Every detail of what was being captured in the shoot as a whole was so important to you. And I wanted to discuss with both of you how that role has sort of changed over time, because I don't necessarily think that every stylist today thinks as holistically, but clearly there's a school there. And I wanted to hear more about how you would define the role of the fashion editor at the time of Bazaar and Vogue when you guys worked together, and how you think it might be different today.
I mean, Paul already described the fact that there were no assistants. I mean, by that time, when we got to Bazaar, we did have assistants, but we were the producers. When we went and wanted a location, when I shot Linda on the aircraft carrier, I found the aircraft carrier, I was the producer. That's what we did. And that's very different from today. I mean, today, your companies are kind of the fulcrum of the whole kit and caboodle. You can't move without them, which is a shame sometimes, because the opportunity that happened when it was a very, very small group of people that were out there just making an image, there was something very, very special and sacred about that kind of relationship and intimacy Depends on the relationship, actually, that you have with the team, but it has changed a lot. Don't you agree, Paul?
Yeah. I think for me, it was actually a very difficult transition going from doing it ourselves and having very small, I was going to say staff, but a small team working. Just because of the nature of the world has changed, because of social media, because of how things happen in the world for manufacturers to make money and stuff. You have to do many more pictures in a day. I think the difference is the editor at the time, because they were the producer, kind of ran the studio in a certain way. You know, it was like the photographer was the final word because it's a photograph. So whatever the photographer wants kind of is what's going to happen. Because if they don't see the picture, you're not getting the picture. So it's really, you have to facilitate them. But I think as the editor, you kind of facilitated everything happening. You were the place where the possibility of something great happening existed. And I think why Tonne and I have had very nice careers, very successful careers, and have been part of photographs that are part of the, consciousness of that time period was because we both believed in possibility and allowing people to be who they are, not forcing them to do something. And we're very specific about what we like. The hairdresser would say, I want to do this. And I would think that is the worst idea possible. If you say no right away, all they want is the no. They want whatever you're not letting them do. So the thing is, I would just say, let's try it. If it works, great. If not, we'll change it. Because you can change things. That's a great thing about what we do is we're all fast enough that we can change things. And I think it worked because you get a surprise. I could describe to the hairdresser what I want. I could describe to the makeup artist, even the photographer, but it runs through their filter. So it's going to come out differently anyway. You would always say to me, since you don't do hair and makeup, whatever you're thinking, they're going to do it better than you can imagine it because that's what they do. And you have them because they're brilliant. For me, it changed a lot. I don't do shoots anymore. So Tonne still does. So she knows better than I do. But what changed for me was having people micromanage the shoot. Like, you have 5 minutes to get this shot. It's like, the shot may take 3 hours. And then the next one may take 10 seconds. If you micromanage it, you kind of know when you have the shot. You don't need to be told.
Right.
And, we're also adults. We're aware of how much time we have. And so it's predicated on something different than it used to be.
But one of the sort of enduring things that happened to me that I've really learned from it was that everything does happen for a reason. In every single circumstance, something did happen for a reason and something better came out of it. So whenever I have gotten a situation that is quite dire, I just feel that it's an opportunity to look around, to see what's there. I mean, it is quite magical, I think, because it has happened so often to me. And so many times I've had assistants that have literally had a breakdown. And I have said, you don't understand. Take it easy. Everything really does happen for a reason. And I think that has kept me positive throughout all the changes that have happened in terms of working in a magazine and taking an image, helping realize an image.
How long did it take you to realize that pearl of wisdom?
I tripped so dramatically early on in my career that I just thought, okay, listen, I can't have a breakdown about this because there are too many things that are great. This is a learning experience. Just take it for what it is and move on. Having that kind of philosophy, that trip didn't happen for no reason. Absolute learning experience of what I can rely on, what I can't rely on, what I need to be able to develop, how I need to handle things that I am not expecting. It was pretty early on, I think.
Don't you think we learned to pivot a lot? Like,
yes.
I always think it's like we have a plan. I always think there's plan A. That's all there ever is. Plan A. This is what's going to happen.
Right.
And then you have to be ready for something to shift. And I think the thing is, if you don't think of it as a problem, but something that just come up, I think it's not giving it the power of being detrimental. This has happened and we just have to, figure it out. Like we've been on locations that, suddenly you're at the location, they say you can't shoot here anymore. And then you have to just go out in the street and do a whole other shoot.
Right.
And you could either freak out, call it off and say, will we do it again, which is an option, or you can just go in the street and do it. There's a million options and opportunities.
The great example is the one I did with Stephen Klein and Amber, did one where we went to Poughkeepsie, of all places. I'm pretty sure it was Poughkeepsie, because there was a railroad station that we wanted to shoot at. We got up there. They reneged the permission to do it. And we were like sitting in this, horrible little hotel, figuring out what we were going to do. And at that moment, down the mainstream came a vintage car convention. And it was just that we stopped the first car and we said, would you like to be in a photograph with us? And they did. And there's that wonderful picture.
I wanted it to be the cover of her book. She didn't listen to me. But anyway.
I showed Anna both the covers and Anna said, I think it should be that one. And actually, it was a great cover because it was a wraparound. It was actually a spread. Mm-hmm. So it made a wraparound. But it's the picture of Amber putting something in the slot of a bank. And, there's a beautiful vintage 50s car that has jumped onto the sidewalk and has stopped there. And that was the whole shoot in the end with Garen and I can't remember, unfortunately, who did the makeup, but it's one of my favorite photographs that I've worked on and never would have happened. It wasn't my preconceived idea to get, vintage 50 cars into a photograph, into a story.
But I think that's what also made the job fun is that there's a story. Mm-hmm. Every day is different. Every time you go into the studio, if the model has a cold, you have a different shoot than you would have had she been healthy that day. There's so many things that could happen. And it's that the possibilities change and it's the shifting. And I think that's what made the job exciting because it was never an everydayness. There was not a by roteness to it. It was just changing.
I actually have a really good line from you, Paul, about Tonne. Let's see where it is. Everydayness turned into something covetable. That's what's always so great about a Tonne Goodman picture. You believe the life, which I just thought was such a beautiful way to sort of capture someone's work or their codes and their creative language. But how is it that one avoids creative calcification over time? How do we continue generating ideas and things that arrive at that point of impact and inspire?
You have to be alive. You just have to be alive. I mean, I think we're very fortunate in that we both have our families. So we have generations clashing because I have a daughter who was obviously younger than me. So I would hear new music. I would see what they were dressing like, what the teens look like. And I don't think you necessarily need to have children see it. I think you just have to be aware. You can't, you have to keep your eyes open. What we do is visual. So you have to be visually stimulated and be aware of what you're looking at and want to look at something. I think it's the desire.
The emotional factor, I think, that is apparent in both of our body of work is that there has been an emotional connection to whatever we are visualizing. I mean, for me, it's happened a lot. For you, it has happened a lot as well. But, personal experiences have filtered their way into my work always. Mm-hmm. An emotional reaction to whatever the subject is. That's, for me, what makes it compelling to do it, actually. And this picture of the angel with Paul. By the way, Paul, somebody has copied that picture, Shalom, and I just saw it on Instagram, actually, or something crazy. The picture of you and Amber in Times Square. Exactly. They've copied it.
It's a Tonne shoot. I'm the model in the shoot. Everyone thinks it's my shoot because I'm in it.
I remember that story and seeing it.
Yeah, but it's because Tonne, I was just the model because I would get up early enough in the morning to do it.
Well, we all had to get up in the morning early enough to do it so that we didn't get run over.
On Times, because we were on Times Square doing it in the street, in the middle of the street.
In the middle of the street at dawn.
Well, it's funny you guys bring up generations in terms of sustaining creative edge or awareness or inspiration or whatever it might be, because Gen Z and millennials have actually made nostalgia more popular than ever. And fashion itself is looking back on its own history, including the works that we're talking about, the pair of you have created today. We've seen that in a number of documentaries and different pieces of content. But why do you think that is? Why now?
I think it's always been that way. I think we looked to the 60s. I've done 1,000 60s throwback shoots and stuff. I think we've always looked back because it is emotional for us. I looked back at reliving those times. And a lot of times it's just faces change. what we find beautiful has changed, in faces, in bodies, and
representation. I mean, representation is so vital right now. And I think that, people looking back are looking for identity. I think everybody is in a position now of really not questioning, not challenging, but identifying with their identity.
If someone's going to look back, here, Tani and I, we're basically the same age. I'm a year older than Tani. Different circumstances, both New Yorkers, though, slightly different circumstances, but our interpretation of the same, like we'll look at a dress, how she might show it in a photograph is going to be slightly different than I show it in a photograph because of our differences, which is, a lot of times economical, different social status, different, race, different religions and stuff. All of that factors in a great way. And I think what's great now that I see is that different people interpreting maybe the same thing, but now there's much more diversity in the people doing it. It's not all from the same social stratus. I think that's going to shift a lot of what we're seeing. Hopefully, that's what the hope is for me.
No, I think that's so perfectly said. And that's something that we're very much seeing manifest in the culture as far as its expression, because a lot of the things that kind of stand apart today versus some of the times that we're talking about is, of course, the fact that was more of a monoculture, right? So what sort of timeless elements do you guys feel have really stood the test of time throughout the spans of your career and the cultural climates that have changed?
I think in the end, it's the desire for beauty. In some form or another. And I don't mean beauty, I mean it in all its forms. But I think it's the through line through all of it is that we want things to be beautiful. And sometimes beautiful is, I remember Stephen Meisel once had said, the one bad apple doesn't spoil the bunch. The one bad apple is the thing that stands out and maybe becomes the more beautiful thing to you. And so
love that.
That's great.
Yeah. So when we think of beauty, it's not beauty as perfection, but the bad apple sometimes is the beautiful thing. It is the thing that catches your eye. It is the thing that gives you an emotional response. And I think beauty has an emotional response. And what we all find beautiful is not exactly the same. And I think that's the newness of what's going on, hopefully in the world of fashion, is that we're not looking at a pre-prescribed idea of beauty.
The only thing I was going to add to that, Paul, because that is so perfectly articulated, is that within that desire for beauty, there is also the desire for provocation. Provocation is discovery. It is possibility. It's like when you look at something, it's not a kind of a pat interpretation of something. It is a springboard for encouraging other thoughts and other aspirations and other emotions, whether it's disgust or whether it is an emotional response to whatever you're looking for.
Because we're not just documenting clothes. We're not a catalog. We're trying to give you an emotional attachment to the clothes, an emotional response to them. So the idea that what can you do to shift this to be almost not acceptable, but still acceptable? Mrs. Vreeland would always say, I remember Keisha told me that Mrs. Vreeland would say that she loved vulgarity. She hated something to be common, but to be vulgar was okay. And I think that's interesting to me.
It's really interesting. It also touches upon a conversation that's very alive and well today, which is that it's quite hard to achieve exactly what you guys are describing in this incredibly visually saturated world we live in. Do you think that's a lazy statement or that it's actually true? To achieve that sort of emotional impact or tension in image making?
It's not lazy, it's just not true.
Love that.
When you see, you had on the woman who did the sets for
Shona Heath for Poor Things.
Poor Things. It was an incredible world she created. That was an incredible, beautiful world. And she's in the world that we're all in, saturated, with imagery. I think for me, what I loved about one of the many things I loved about working, but to work with people, the photographers, the hair, the makeup, that had the idea of, pushing limits, of doing something that you couldn't imagine. And I think it's harder because we're going faster. But I always wonder, are we going faster because I'm old? So to me, it's faster. If you're born in this moment that's just the what's so of the situation. I'm just going to talk about fashion in the sense, a lot of older people have stepped away a little bit and have allowed younger people to come up, and we're going to start seeing things that we hadn't seen before because of the way they're interpreting it with their youth and their experience. And, I think that's what's exciting.
I mean, that's what keeps fashion an insatiably interesting space to occupy, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit less inspirational, but definitely relevant when it comes to contemporary discourse. And that's, of course, the subject of sustainability. And I was actually speaking to an editor who plays a similar role to yourself, Tonne, at a different title. And she was sort of on the low confessing a sense of imposter syndrome because she felt like she's discovered that a lot of the progress and promise has amounted to very little actual offering in terms of the luxury sector and what's coming out of it. Do you feel like we've achieved some meaningful progress there? Do you think we're still in the era of really good marketing?
But I think that we have so fallen short of what we need to do. It's very, very disheartening because I just feel that for the benefits of capitalism, of which there are many, this is an example where it is playing against survival, essentially, really. I mean, the big companies that have the wherewithal, that have the range, the reach, the finances, for them not to be buying into this, and I'm saying buying in literally spending their dollars with innovation and with spreading the knowledge that they gain from the innovation is so lacking in foresight. It's like, where's the foresight? It's going to catch up with us. We all know it. It's just not going to last forever.
And it's a little bit of a pivot, but as we approach the end of our conversation and very much on the subject of what we've discussed throughout the span of today, fashion's always been a business, but it's become a bigger business than it ever has before. And that has kind of seen the waxing and waning of the role played by the dream or fantasy in this industry. What role do you think dreams or fantasy, even though, Paul, you've said that your work doesn't include fantastical sort of stylings, what role do you think the dream or fantasy plays in fashion today?
Where is it?
I have to be honest. I feel that because of the speed in which we are expected to put out imagery, the amount of photographing that has to get done, the amount of posting, there's no leisure in thought because everyone has a fantasy life. If you have a pulse, there's things that you fantasize about. The new generation is now getting comfortable in where they are. Tonne and I both feel like we're grounded in reality somehow, but there is a fantasy aspect to it. I think we don't have the same outlets that we used to have. So what people are looking at the moment is like something small in their hand. It's their phone, or their computer, which is certainly smaller than the screen of your television set or the screen of a movie.
Now I have two different thoughts going on because where you went just now, Paul, was the arts. What the importance of the arts within our lives. And I remember my sister, Wendy, making this wonderful proclamation that the arts have the power to deliver us from evil. And I think it's a kind of fabulous expression because it's so true. That one of the things that occurred to me with fantasy was that I think that we have a much more acceptable appreciation of fantasy because of drag, because drag came into the culture. And I think that notion of fantasy that it promotes and that it accepts and that it embraces and that it, allows other people to think differently. I think it's such an amazing contribution to the way people are feeling about fantasy now and about identity. I mean, the identity crisis is so big, don't you think? I think that, one of the things that the pandemic did was stop time and leave you all alone. And when you're all alone, what are you going to do? You're going to examine your own destiny. Everything that is meaningful to you is put on the table. I think that everybody today, with sustainability, with the political situation, I think that the reflection on yourself and what is meaningful to you and what therefore can have any truth, significance, who cares? You have to care. And so I think we're all in a position now of, the question is, who cares? And the answer is, I do.
I feel like you just answered our namesake question that everybody has to, but I'm going to ask it anyway to see which bit you want to allocate. And that is, what is contemporary now?
What is contemporary? What is going on right now? Honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Major question.
But that is a very good answer. And what is yours, Paul?
I don't have an answer for it because in fashion, I think it's a question. What's contemporary? Because we're always looking to, maybe in the arts, what's new. I think in life, like in everydayness of like getting through the day, getting someone to school, getting yourself to work, putting food on the table. I don't know if it means anything or it matters. Like it matters so much less to me now what's modern, what's right, because I'm not in that world any longer. So it doesn't matter to me in the same way that it did. Like I felt like I had to know what was current, what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point in my life, I'm not sure that it matters what's contemporary, because what matters are the things that have always mattered.
Mm-hmm.
What's contemporary is, being kind. You should always be kind. I don't really know the answer to it, because to me, it only exists within certain things, like fashion, art, movies, but that seems to be trending, like a trend, not a thing. So I don't really know. I don't have an answer.
I have another answer.
Okay, good.
Okay. My other answer is this, that there is an anthem that needs to be shouted from the rooftops. And that is, do unto others the way you would have them do unto you. That is what is contemporary now in the world, and what everybody has to take as their raison d'etre, their reason to live. That's contemporary right now for me.
Blessed be your lips to God's ears. It's something that the world definitely needs to consider on a day-to-day basis with everything going on. Thank you both for taking the time. It was an absolute pleasure.
I had a wonderful time.
It was fun. I had a good time.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our producer, Sasha Grinblatt. Audio post-production by Chase Coughlin with original theme music by Joseph Topmiller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft. And visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes each week. And if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for additional content and join the conversation. Let us know what you think is contemporary now.